fellow freaks, geeks, and yeah, cats, peeps, because I'm joined once again by my lovely friend Kat. Hey, Kat.
Hey, Kelsi.
So excited, we're talking more slashers. Today, blood, guts, it's beautiful. At least to me. I don't know how you feel about it, but I like talking about this stuff.
I do too. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it.
We're very morbid, but in a cool, fun way. In a nice way. We're very nice people. Don't be fooled by our interest in the macabre. We just like this type of stuff. At least in movie form, not in real life form.
Right. We would not want to see this in real life.
No. I don't want to see any kind of slashing take place in front of my eyes. No, thank you. But I'm very happy to be here with you guys today talking about slashers, because that's what we're going to talk about. And specifically, we're going to talk about one slasher movie called Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. And I think it's a great movie to talk about because in the same chat, we also want to discuss what makes a slasher movie a slasher movie? What are the criteria that make something a slasher? And are there any definitive criteria? Or is it just up in the air? So we're going to talk about all that. There's all this academic stuff we found online that we'll delve into. It's a lot of stuff, I got to tell you. But Leslie Vernon is the perfect movie to talk about when we're talking about what is a slasher, because it's so meta. It's got so many winks and nods to the whole genre of slashers and also just to all the tropes of slasher films as well. So I'm excited to talk about this movie with you, Kat.
I know. I loved it. I loved it so very much. I just loved everything about it. Loved how it was shot, in that documentary style. So tell us what it's about and give us what other people think about it.
Okay, so Behind the Mask was released in 2006, and the synopsis is it's a nice, normal-looking guy named Leslie Vernon, but he has an obsession with movie-style slashers like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger. Leslie decides to follow in the footsteps of his heroes, and ever the self-promoter, he invites a documentary filmmaker named Taylor and her crew to follow him around as he constructs his own grisly legacy. I love that synopsis, and the movie did not fail to deliver. The movie was marvelous. It was really well executed. It was just a gem. And in terms of, let's see what other people thought of the movie. The ratings, 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb, 76% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is a decent rating. And even higher than that, 85% of Google users liked the movie. And I can see why, because it was a good time and a very fun look at slashers as like a trope overall and as a whole subgenre. Wonderful stuff, great examination, great fun, great wink winks to the audience. I loved every bit of it. Kat, what did you think about it?
Like I said, I loved it. I liked the way it was like the documentary style. You've got this crew coming in and they're gonna, see what he's all about. They're not really sure about him. I mean, they're not really sure if he's just kind of like pulling their leg. He's talking about all these different things he has to do in order to pull off, being the perfect slasher. I loved at the beginning where he's taking them around the town and he's showing them Michael Myers' house and like where Freddy Krueger would have lived and, all the different places and talking about how they were like his heroes and, way up there as far as being like, slashers that are well known, and he wants to be that caliber of a slasher, so I think at the very beginning, I mean, Taylor and her crew just think he's such a nice guy. I mean, he's likable, he's charming, he's normal looking. He's played by the actor Nathan Basil, and he comes across as this like nice guy, the boy next door kind of guy who you just really are like, what? I mean, he's not too bad. I can't imagine him like cutting somebody up or whatever. So you don't really know, is this guy for real? And I think that's the same thing with these people that are following him around. And he starts off, he takes them to the girl, the one that's going to be the girl he's going to consider his survivor girl or his final girl. And they go through the whole process of what a slasher, the killer would do in a slasher film. Nothing happens that evening, but it like sets it up. And while you're watching it, you're just thinking, oh my gosh, this is the perfect homage to slasher films. I mean, it's just like, this is wonderful. This is like what the screenwriter must be thinking about when he's, writing the script for a slasher film, you know?
This was totally an ode to slashers, and
Mhm.
especially classic slashers, because like you referenced, there are literal name drops of Michael Myers. Now they don't say the whole name. They kind of say, when Leslie talks about him, he actually even uses first name,
Right, right,
he
right.
uses their first names, like he's friends with them, like, yeah, Michael, blah, blah, blah. It's great. And Freddy,
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. If anybody is a fan of slasher films,
it's a
you will
perfect ode.
totally know who he's talking about when he references it.
Yeah,
You
I love
know,
it. Yeah, and I feel like whoever made the film, like everyone involved, it was just a labor of love. And it was definitely something that they wanted to pay tribute to those great movies that they also, obviously, it's very apparent that they love. And also, it was a nice examination, as I kind of teased in the beginning, of what makes a slasher, because Leslie's literally talking in front of the documentary crew about his process, what constitutes what's going to happen, how he picks his final girl, what has to happen. There has to be a connection between him and her. And so,
right.
she's got to be virginal. He says all this stuff that, usually wouldn't be talked about in a horror movie. But it's all the stuff we as the audience already know from having watched a ton of slasher movies. These are the things that they all have in common, or most of them have in common. And we're going to talk more about that
And then
later.
the other thing too that I found was interesting was he was talking about these guys like, well, they live in the neighborhood. They're like just
Yeah.
normal, everyday people who did what they needed to do to, like it was an occupation, like
Yeah.
being a killer.
Yes, it was a very nonchalant way of
right.
talking about it. And that's what made it even more intriguing. You're watching it and you're like, why is he so nonchalant about all of this? But not only that, I feel like the documentary film crew was nonchalant for the most part until the very end. And by the way, we should say we're going to be talking about spoilers. So
yes,
if you haven't seen the movie, you might want to wait to watch our chat until after you've watched it. But if you already watched it, then go ahead, keep going, keep playing this video, because we're gonna get into the spoiler territory. And yes, at the end, when we find out that he's actually going to kill and is killing, then the documentary film crew starts to get like, oh God, this is real. We can't sit by and let this happen. And then things start to go in motion, and a big twist ends up happening with who the final girl actually ends up being.
Right.
It's
Well,
different.
even you and I talked about it after we had watched the movie. When we were watching it individually, I mean, I was thinking to myself, and I actually watched it with my son Andrew, and I was like, they're not going to actually just sit by and let him like
Yes.
murder these people.
I
And
was like,
that's
why
when-
are they documenting this? Like, don't they wouldn't this have a problem to air on TV? Like, you're literally accomplices to murder. So I guess
Exactly.
they didn't think that he was really going to go through with it. So
Right.
at
That's
the
what I
end,
think.
yeah,
I mean, I'm almost wondering, like, what did they think, that he was just somebody who was like enjoyed the genre and just called him out? Hey, like, was it like a Halloween prank kind of thing? That's what I was kind of thinking maybe they were thinking about.
I don't know, because then we see the documentary film crew and Leslie spend time with basically Leslie's mentor, who is also another killer. And he's now married to his final girl, it seems like. You and I think he's married to the final girl. So Eugene is his name, played by a wonderful actor.
Oh, yeah.
One of your favorite characters.
Yes, from The Walking Dead. Yes,
my favorite character from The Walking Dead, period. I haven't watched all of The Walking Dead, but when I did watch it, Herschel. That was
I
my favorite character.
know, and he has since passed away, which is very, very sad because he's a wonderful actor.
You met him.
Yes, Andrew and I actually met him at the Wizard World Comic Con in New Orleans one year, and we took a picture with him. It was just so exciting. I mean, he was a wonderful man, wonderful to talk to. But what was so great about Eugene is, like, they go visit him and they go, well, first of all, he's not like in the house. They have to go in the woods, and he's like in a coffin underground. So they have to like get him out.
He's practicing how to slow his breathing so he can appear dead, which I loved how they talked about all these little things like, oh, I'm going to use fire retardant so that if I get burned alive, I can, still survive. So they're talking about all these little tricks that would seem like they're supernatural, but it really shows you that like real life people can be these supernatural killers that we know of in slashers. Like, for instance, the whole reason Eugene's in that little coffin area is to try to, make it so that he doesn't have to breathe as, evidently. So somebody might come up to him and think he's dead because he's breathing so shallowly, and he's training so that will happen.
Exactly.
That's all very fascinating that they took that spin on it. Like, these guys aren't supernatural, they just have trained to be this certain way.
Right. And he's apparently retired. And
Yes.
they allude to the fact that he might possibly be a killer from another slasher film that you and I watched, which
Yeah.
was Black Christmas, 1974. So supposedly he is Billy from Black Christmas. Okay, so I don't know. I mean,
which is technically, a lot of people consider it to be the first official slasher movie, we should say, kind of the birth of the slasher film. So I think that's very interesting that that's a direct homage and a direct ode to the birth of the slasher. And they're
right,
examining slashers. So it's
exactly.
just genius. The whole meta aspect of it, the whole self-referential aspect of the movie. I love it. I love stuff that just references like, what it is, basically meta things, just extra fun.
Right, right. I do too. I mean, and I like how it all tied in. And I like the fact that they allude to the fact that just in the conversation that his wife Jamie was his final girl.
Yeah.
Just I thought it was
they were
good.
even joking about it between each other, Eugene and Jamie. They were like, oh yeah.
And what was so funny about that too was also the fact that like she just seemed like it was just normal to be married to a retired killer from a slasher film.
Well, not only that, they were both acting like it was normal, like, oh, Leslie, we wish you would have picked a safer, thing to try to be, but we support him. So it was all very weird how normal everything was. But I think that really gave the movie a unique flair. And it made it so different from other movies on our list this year. Because we watched this whole chat, the reason we're having this is because we did a whole marathon in the month of July. We did a summer slasher marathon. And guys, if you do want to check out what we had to say about all the movies, check out our overall chat, which I'll link up here, and I'll also link it down in the description. We had a really long discussion and we were live in person and it was so much fun. It's truly one of my favorite chats we've ever had, but we talk a little bit about this movie Behind the Mask, but we're breaking it down much deeper today. But we talk about a lot of the other movies that had to do with slashing, and which were technical slashers, but we'll get into it later. We're not really even sure if some of them are slashers or not, even still after researching what a slasher is. We're going to break that down, but we also have other chats up, like our Sleepaway Camp chat. Again, I'll link that up there and also in the description, as well as our Terrifier chat, which was a lot of fun. God, that was a creepy movie. But yeah, this movie is so much different from all of those. It's just a very different feel, vibe, and style.
Right. I mean, it kind of reminded me. It's not similar, but it kind of reminded me of the film The Final Girls, which I also watched on in the marathon, but you had watched it previously, because again, it kind of focuses on those, slasher film tropes, which I thought it was like, it just kind of made you started paying attention to some of the other films that we were watching. And, he takes you through, Leslie Vernon takes you through everything he's planning on doing, why he's going to do it. And even the documentary crew even says to him at one point, it's like, well, you're kind of setting them up. Like, you have it to where, you're rigging things that they're going to end up falling into like your traps, basically, or whatever. And I think once they really start thinking, oh my gosh, he's really going to go through with this, it's kind of good that they know, because then they're going to try, if they can, to save as many people as they can. Right. The other thing too is there's like the whole thing about the final girl. He's got his sights set on someone else, but is that a red herring to throw us, the movie watcher, off, because his final girl is not really who he claims is his final girl.
And that was his plan all along. It's really masterful storytelling, and I feel like it was just so well laid out. And there were hints though along the way. So if you watch it once and then you see who the real final girl is, and then I think if you go back and watch it, which I do plan on doing one day, then I think you'll pick up a whole bunch of different little cues. For instance, I mean, I really feel like there was a lot of chemistry between Taylor and Leslie the whole time.
I did too. And I kind of felt like, where are they going to go with this direction? I almost thought maybe like he would abandon
I thought
going
too,
through with everything,
maybe.
because somehow Taylor would convince him, or he would feel like, okay, this is not really what I want to do because
I
I
want to be
really
with
like this
her.
girl and
Yeah.
she seems like she likes me, kind of thing. But it didn't go that route. But I really do almost wonder if he even thought he could impress her, and still end up getting her in the end. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because he just seems so confident and he seems so happy about it. I don't know. It was just
And
really
she seemed to really like him. I mean, there were moments where she's like super close to him. There's like really hardcore flirting going on between
right.
them. I mean,
Right.
it's palpable on screen. They've got a great chemistry. They cast it really well because the two actors really worked well on camera together for sure. I could feel their chemistry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They did such a good job portraying that because it's what was supposed to happen. And we find out later, Taylor has a much bigger part in things than we initially think. And like I said, there's spoilers, and that's the spoiler we're talking about, is that Taylor is the real final girl. And like I said, it's hinted at by the flirting because Leslie talks about how there has to be a connection between the final girl and the killer because they complete each other. They're like a yin and a yang, and the killer actually allows the final girl to elevate and become the ultimate version of herself. So there's this whole psychological examination going on. And that's like kind of a secondary element of the whole movie. This whole like, analysis, the psychoanalysis of everything.
Well, and also too, when you're talking about final girl, also it's the girl that seems to be pure, or the one that is not given into the vices. That's why so many times when you see a slasher film, the couple that gets killed together, it's because they're doing a little hanky panky in the bedroom
And that's
or
the
in the
first couple
car
that gets
or
killed.
whatever. And so
Yes.
that's what happens in the film. And he even
Yes.
says they're going to be up there doing this. So I think the first clue that we know that the person that he says is going to, the one that he goes that evening to stalk, the girl that is supposed to be his final girl, is when we find out she's not a virgin.
Yeah.
And so then we realize, well, I think that was also a clue for them. Oh my gosh, these people are really in danger at this point, because he thinks that, and that's not who's going to be coming for.
Yeah.
So we got to make sure we protect all these people. But I mean, I think the film also had some really great actors in it. I mean, you have
Yes.
Scott Wilson that plays Eugene. Robert Englund makes his appearance in here. Of course, we all know him from Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street,
And that was
which,
another little wink to the audience, like, hey, you know him. We're mentioning literally his character by name, and you know him from that movie. So it's another little wink to slasher fans.
right. I mean, it was great. He was Doc Halloran. He's supposed to be Leslie's psychiatrist. We find out that he's going to throw a monkey wrench in all of Leslie's plans, because he also reveals that Leslie Vernon is not his name. The origin story that Leslie's coming up with is not true, and that he's just the psychopath. And he's going to try and stop Leslie from going through with his whole entire plan. So I just thought that was awesome. Then we also have Zelda Rubinstein in here, who is from Poltergeist fame. She plays the library, Mrs. Collinswood.
I also
If
want to
you
say she
remember,
was in the great movie Teen Witch, which is
yes, she
very
was.
corny,
Yes,
but
she
I
was.
love her. She's so cute. And you've
She's
got some.
precious, precious, precious. I mean, she was Tangina in Poltergeist. She played the clairvoyant, or the medium that comes to check out the poltergeist at the home. I mean, one of the best lines that she says in that film were, "Don't y'all mind hanging back? Y'all jamming the frequencies." I know I can't talk exactly like she does, but it was just so funny. I can remember that film, and I haven't seen it in so long, but I can remember that line in there. But what's fascinating about her to me is that, I like all the actors, because acting is one of my interests. And she didn't actually start pursuing acting until she was about 45 years old. She worked in the medical field for a little while, and she decided she wanted to leave that. She left a stable job to pursue acting. And one of her first films, her movie debut, was one with Chevy Chase called Under the Rainbow. She played a little person in that film, which was a comedy. And then she got her big break in Poltergeist, and that's when she played Tangina. And she actually, this film, Behind the Mask, was her last film before she passed away. She passed away in 2010, but she was an actor for almost I don't know, about 31, 32 years, which I think, oh my goodness, that's like a whole nother lifetime, so
I
she had like
know,
basically two full careers,
which is
to do that.
amazing. And it's amazing
Yes.
that she pursued basically acting so late in life, but succeeded
Hmm.
at it. And I think her uniqueness, because she also has a really unique voice, and I think
Yes.
that really lent to her getting cast in these great roles and kind of made her stand out above the crowd. I just love her. I mean, in Teen Witch
Yeah.
especially, I don't know why. I just think her part is so great, and her chemistry with the actress who's the Teen Witch is really just amazing on
Well,
camera.
she gives me hope that I still
There
have a
is hope.
chance.
You're awesome, Kat. You do definitely have a chance. You definitely have a chance.
But anyway, I just thought that was wonderful. Well-rounded cast. I mean, we mentioned this in our overall chat that Taylor Gentry, the journalist, is actually played by Angela. Is it Gothals?
I
Is that
think
how we
so.
pronounce her name? Who played Kevin McAllister's older sister. What is the
Yes.
famous line that she says, Kelsi?
You're what the French call les incompetents. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but I'm pretty sure she's the character who says that.
Yes,
Because
I
she's
believe
blonde
so.
and
I
yeah.
believe so.
I love that part of the movie. I just love Home Alone, period. So yeah, it's
Yeah, I
wonderful.
just think it's great. And like I had mentioned in that chat, there are little things in it, like her hat in there matches Kevin's gloves from Home Alone, like the
Amazing.
pattern, which I just think is just so awesome.
That's another
Um,
reason why I have to rewatch it, because I didn't
yes,
notice that the first time around. So now I want to notice the hat and really see if it's just like Kevin's gloves.
right. I mean, we
Same.
don't ever do really any research on these movies prior,
Right.
to watching them. And so it's almost like after we research it, we do need to go back and rewatch again because we
Yeah.
find out so many fascinating things about the movie, how the movie was, produced, some little behind the scene facts, of things that happen, sometimes who they originally chose for an actor and the actor gets replaced. And sometimes when I find out that they originally chose an actor for something, I'm like, ooh,
Like
I
I
wouldn't
Am
have chosen. Yeah,
Legend, we were
like I
talking
would.
about in our zombie chat, all the different
Right.
people who eventually, luckily, it
Like
was Will Smith.
I could not see Tom Cruise playing that part, in I Am Legend. Sorry. I like Tom Cruise for a lot of things, but not for that.
No, he would not have worked. Like I really heartfeltly believe he wouldn't have worked. It
Right.
just
And
would
I
not
mean
come off the same.
this young guy, Nathan Basil, I have never seen him in anything else, but I thought he was perfect as this part,
Yes,
you
because you
know.
had to be likable, but you also had to have like this different gear to you to be able to kind of flip that switch and kind of and kind of come off like you could be a psycho.
Right.
But it was had to be hidden under the surface for this type of story. And there's this great like photo where like Leslie's kind of in the mirror getting ready to like ramp himself up to kill, and he's like looking all weird and like screaming, like kind of looking like a weird face, and that is creepy. But also he gets emotional, and he's just like,
Yes.
he's talking with Taylor, the documentary filmmaker, and he's like, I'm just so happy because I'm about to fulfill what I feel is my destiny. So he's got an emotional side too. So the
Yes.
character is just so fascinating the way they wrote him. I love it. I
Yeah.
love
And I mean,
everything.
the film was so well received that they were going to do a sequel for the film, which I was so excited about because I'm like, oh, I think there's a second film that's going to, come out or has come out. Unfortunately, one was never made. A sequel was never made because of lack of funding. However, there is a comic book series based on what happens next. It's by Glen Echo Entertainment. It's called Behind the Mask: The Return of Leslie Vernon. So if you watch the film and want a little more of him, you could check out the graphic novel and just keep your fingers crossed that one day they will make a sequel, which I
Right.
think would be fabulous. And one little thing I will say, you must watch this movie all the way through the credits. It's very important that you watch the movie all the
Yes.
way through the credits
Because they
because
they play up on another trope, a supernatural type of trope that
mhm,
seems to pop up in a lot of slasher films. And so that's why there could be more from Leslie Vernon, is because some kind of element, some kind of trope is referenced at the end.
yes. And the other thing about it is you get a clue, you realize, and there was a clue that was given to you as to
Right.
why this played out, and I didn't catch it at first. Andrew's the one that said, remember when? And he gave
Yeah.
me the info. I was like, oh yeah. Good catch, Andrew.
Yeah, yeah.
And the thing about it is, my Andrew does not like horror films. So for him to watch this film, it had some gore in it. It does have the kills and all that, but it's just presented in a totally different way.
Yeah, I think
It's
non-horror fans could definitely easily get into it and like it because it's kind of got like that, like I said, the meta flair and almost like a joke like feel, but at the same time, it's not a joke like in terms of, oh, it's over the top, it's corny. It's
right.
kind of more like an inside joke type of thing versus a
Mhm.
haha, I'm making fun of you type of thing.
Exactly. It's not like a parody, like,
Mm-hmm.
Scary Movie or anything like that. I
No.
mean, it really looks and feels like a documentary being shot, and you're in like the day, like the day in the life of a killer in a slasher film,
Yeah.
and that's what I liked about it. Like, this is an occupation, just like being, a construction worker or being an architect.
And I think that's what they wanted to convey. So they really accomplished that for sure,
Yeah.
because that's what you felt while watching. Like, oh, this is just normal to these people.
Mhm.
Because it's more than just Leslie. He's got a whole network of people,
Right.
which I also find amazing and fascinating. It's just such a unique story, and a perfect way to pay homage to slashers in general.
Mhm.
And unless you have more to say, that kind of could bring us right into our discussion of what is a slasher.
Yeah, what is a slasher, Kelsi? What is it?
Well, it's really hard to answer that question, it turns out, as you and I have just discovered, because we spent the whole afternoon researching different websites, and there's all kinds of papers and articles written,
Mhm.
and even books written about this topic. Like, what are the criteria that make a movie a slasher film? Do
Right.
they have.
There are even academic papers that
Yes.
were written at the university all about, what is a slasher, what constitutes it. To me, it's even more fascinating than when I went down the rabbit hole of researching this. And your definition of a slasher is totally different than, from one thing to the other.
That's the thing is, throughout our research over the past couple of days, and really heavily our research today, every site has something different. There is some cross references where some sites kind of agree with other sites, but really, I think it's hard to find something that is across the board, definitive in terms of
Mhm.
what it is. But like I found this great article called "So You Want to Write a Slasher Horror Story?" And that was from tvtropes.com, and it talked about the necessary tropes in their opinion for a slasher. They said, you got to have a serial killer, you got to have murder victims, and you got to have the survivor. And of course they kind of explain each one. Some of
Mhm.
those are kind of obvious, but the survivor, they're talking about the final girl or one or two survivors. So that's a very basic list of tropes that a movie has to meet, but they kind of go a little bit more in depth to it. But other sites have way more tropes and elements,
Mhm.
and some
Mhm.
even have like, two different elements, and then they break those down even further. So Kat, what
Exactly.
did you discover in your research?
Well, I discovered one thing that everything has in common, and that slasher films is a subgenre of horror films.
Yeah, that's about it. That's about all they agree on officially.
Right. Right. I mean, one of them says that they were most popular from the late 50s to the early 90s. Some people say it didn't start really until 1974 when Black Christmas came out. It's defined by some kind of a killer, like you said. Sometimes they're usually masked, sometimes they're not. They're basically harassing someone and eventually murdering the people that they're
Right.
harassing. Um, and basically they've created most of the tropes that are seen in horror movies across the board. So that's what's so confusing about it in some sense. It's like, because we even watch some movies and we're like, is
Yeah.
this really a slasher, is it not a slasher? But I mean, basically, a couple of different resources that I looked at kind of mention that it's more like blades, something that can cut, something that can slash, hence the name slasher film. It's unusual. They don't say you can't use a gun, but it's unusual for them to
But
use a gun.
I
But
will
you
say
could.
some articles said it must have weapons other than a gun, meaning like you have to have other weapons. If only a gun is present, obviously it's not a slasher.
Right, then it could
That,
not be.
yes.
But we watched Terrifier, and Terrifier is really what got me thinking, well, he used a gun in this one. How can that be a slasher? But then when you really looked across the board at everything he used, the majority of his weapons were like blade-like,
Right.
items. Now, I mean, he did use plastic to try to suffocate somebody, and he also used a van. So it's just,
Right.
it's the matter of, we can't really concentrate so much just on weapons, but I think the majority of the weapons have to be that. Also, we discovered that slasher films, it's really like, I'm going to kill you and it's going to be quick. There's no like
sudden kills, not torture. And that's what separates it from movies like Saw, like where the torture is drawn out. So, I mean, this one list of criteria even says the majority of kills are sudden with limited suffering. The emphasis is on the killing, not on the suffering. And so, you had a really good thought before we started recording. You talked about one of the things in our Terrifier chat, besides talking about the gun and analyzing, is that a slasher or not? Right. We also talked about the whole scene, and this is a spoiler to Terrifier, guys. So if you haven't seen Terrifier, pause this for a second, fast forward a minute, and then, play us again. But a girl gets sawed in half. And so we were thinking, does this kind of cross the line into torture porn? But as you said in the beginning, before we recorded, you said, well, really, it's quick though. It's not really torture because it happens very quick.
Yes, very quick indeed. I mean, everything that he did in the film. So then you had to really examine, okay, now I have to really examine the kills. If someone's going to be kept in a basement for a very long time and he's going to go pick them apart every day, he's going to pick a piece of them off, that's going to be more torture porn, because ultimately they're going to die. But is it going to be necessarily that they die because he's going to kill them, or they're going to die because they're going to have a loss of blood, that kind of thing. Whereas, I mean, clearly he does end her life, and it is not a slow at all.
Right. And he does kill like pretty quickly a lot of people in the movie. It's not drug out very much. Even the guy he kills in a pretty brutal way with the decapitation, he does that very quickly as well. Yeah. And so, yes, every element we were kind of questioning, but Terrifier does seem to fit the slasher genre and label for sure.
Yes. I mean, after delving into this and getting into the facts, I was like, yeah, I definitely have to put it down as that. And when we had talked to Ray, he felt like it was a slasher. Yeah. So, and not so much torture porn, which I was like, that was good, because except for that scene and maybe one other in the movie, it really didn't. I mean, it followed the format a little bit more of a slasher film for sure. Right. Another thing I discovered is that there are actually two subtypes of a slasher film. So it's almost like there's the genre, then you have subgenres, then you have subtypes, because the slasher film has evolved since it started back in 1974.
And it's still constantly evolving even now. It is still.
But what I've found out is there's two types. There's the cipher format, and this is basically, the killer's identity. Okay. And this format is usually what you would see like in Halloween. We know that this is Michael Myers, even though he's wearing a mask. Sometimes they could wear a mask, sometimes they might not, but you still know who it is.
Right.
Then there's the whodunit format. And this is what, audience members are like, not really sure who the killer is. And you would see this in like Sleepaway Camp. You don't know who the killer is until the end of the movie.
Or Black Christmas even.
Yes, or Black Christmas for that matter. So when you look at it that way, you're like, okay, these movies can have a twist to it at the end, kind of thing. And so they do give you those little red herrings to steer you off into a different direction. And then you have no clue, until the end. And you're like, okay.
Even the first Friday the 13th, one of the articles references that would fit into that type of slasher film. The whodunit. Yes,
the whodunit. So I found that very interesting, that it would be that way. And then also too, there's just, when you start thinking about what are some of the elements, well, whenever you think of a slasher film, it's generally, we think of young adults, we think
Yeah.
of teenagers, and they're in a group, and they're usually somewhere teenagers hang out. For example, summer camp, or high school, dances, or in the high school hall, or anything to do with high school. The suburbs, it's the sleepy little town, where the killer comes in. So they're just certain little elements that have that feel of it, but it's generally one killer,
Right.
that's doing it. It's not multiple killers, so I don't know. I just find it all fascinating.
I find it fascinating too. And like just the amount of different takes on this topic is just such a great thing to
Mhm.
dive into, because you could spend weeks reading and researching about this. But the thing I came across that I think really says it the best, there was this great article that you and I actually both happened to look up separately, and we're like, oh, we both looked up the same article. It's www.thefinalgirl.com. What is a slasher film? And the article is entitled, What is a Slasher? So it says, and I'm quoting directly from the article, it says, slashers today more than ever exist on a spectrum, with the serial killer thrillers at one end, maybe, and splatter and torture horror at the other end, possibly. An exclusively teenage cast isn't necessary anymore, nor is a non-urban setting needed, or the inclusion of a prologue to hint at the killer's past or motivation. For these reasons, it is much more difficult to set down a definitive criteria which must be met by a particular film to qualify as a slasher. For the purpose of this site and its content, however, we've come up with two lists of elements, one primary and one secondary, to help define slasher films as we see them. And I actually really like their two lists of elements, so
I
I'm going to
agree.
read them. Yeah, their list is really well done, and I think it's kind of standard to where most people would agree with this. But again, just to emphasize, not all sites have this same criteria. It's just
Mhm.
this particular site, thefinalgirl.com. But just to go through it, so the primary elements, according to this site, are: a killer stalks a group of people. The killer uses a weapon or weapons other than a gun. The majority of kills are sudden with limited suffering. This is what I talked about earlier. The emphasis is on the killing, not the suffering. That's what I was quoting from earlier. And the movie, according to this site, was released during or after 1974. So they don't consider like Psycho a slasher,
Right.
because Psycho was before. So
Right. They many of the sites consider Psycho as an influence
right,
on
so
the
not a true
slasher film.
slasher.
Right. Right.
And so their secondary, that was the primary elements according to finalgirls.com. And this is the secondary elements. And they're saying that the secondary elements must not strictly be present, but at least a few of them should be present. So they don't have to have all of these in a movie to be a slasher, but a few would help to, for the film to be considered one.
Mhm.
So those are: the movie begins with a prologue. The movie takes place in an isolated, non-urban setting. The killer's identity is hidden or unknown to the victims, at least initially. The victims are representative of the target audience. So, teenagers, young adults, because that's what a lot of these slasher films are geared towards. The victims participate in leisure activities before the killing begins, hanging out at summer camp, chilling, babysitting at a house, whatever, having sex, drinking, etc. The kills are creative or elaborate, but as dictated by the primary criteria, the majority of kills remain sudden. So they can be creative, but still sudden. Tension is built up before the killing begins. Tension is built through stalking. That seems to be a big factor in a lot of these films that I've actually recognized. I do agree with that. But again, it doesn't have to have stalking to be a slasher, but it seems to be one of the secondary important elements. The body count exceeds 3. That's another big one there.
Mhm.
In the end, only a small group of survivors remain, often only one, often a woman, the final girl. As mentioned, not all of the secondary elements need to be present for a film to qualify as a slasher, but the more that are present, the more the movie fits this site's definition
Right.
of a slasher. And again, just to plug the site again. This is all from thefinalgirl.com, and specifically the article is titled "What is a Slasher?" And I really like this article. It is actually a lot longer than that. There are some editing mistakes in the article, but still really informative, and it actually has some sources where it quoted like from books that really examine more about this question.
Yeah, and then talking about where you say the victims participate in leisure activities, Roger Ebert, the critic, referred to them as dead teenager movies.
Yes.
Because they mainly focused on teenagers. They're also known as body count film movies, body count films or movies.
Right.
So I just think that's pretty interesting. He was not like a fan of like Friday the 13th.
I have looked up some of his reviews. He does not like those type. He doesn't like Halloween. No, he doesn't rate those movies highly at all. And I mean, horror is not really looked at. I mean, this could be a whole nother discussion. It's very frowned upon as a genre as a whole. We're talking about not about the subgenre of slashers, but horror as a whole. It's pretty frowned upon amongst critics.
Well, and also too, slasher films are kind of considered B movies.
Yeah.
So it doesn't get the, the accolades. If you think about it, how many horror movies have won an Oscar? I mean, they're just not taken as seriously, even though they are well done. There are some really well done horror movies out there and some really well done slasher films. My husband and I just had a thematic Friday the 13th date night on this past Friday the 13th, August 13th. And we had so much fun. We hadn't seen the original Friday the 13th in so long. I had forgotten about some of the kills. I forgot Kevin Bacon was in it. I mean, there were some things that I can't even say some. There were like 2 things that I remembered from watching it originally. And there's a surprise twist at the end. And I was like, and I knew about that, but I forgot about how it all came about. So it was like watching it with fresh eyes. And I'm like, this really does hold up. This film holds up. I mean, I compared it to some of the 80s films that I watched in July for our marathon, and they pale in comparison to this film. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So I can see why they ended up with a franchise, and that Jason Voorhees became one of the most popular, killers out there.
Well, I mean, if you look at something like Halloween, I mean, it's shot really very uniquely. It's got some really cool perspective shots, especially in the beginning where we literally see Michael as a kid put on his mask, but you're seeing it through his eyes. So the camera is his perspective and the mask goes over the camera essentially. So you're literally his eyes. It's wonderfully done. And in fact, so although critics don't usually like these movies, at least in film school now, because I went to UNO's film school, University of New Orleans, and we did watch some clips from Halloween, and the film professor talked about how important and influential it was. And so at least sometimes in some circles, it's still talked about and revered in a positive way. Whereas, critics, that's just a certain type of reviewer. Obviously it's they're looking at it from a certain way, whereas a fan can look at it from another way.
Exactly.
So I do think movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th hold up, and they offer something really cool. And they also make you think, because this whole thing about what a slasher is, it really kind of makes you wonder, why do we like to watch all these, like this death on screen? What does that say about us? You could just examine this so much. And I think something great about horror, not just slashers, but it makes you confront what you're afraid of. It throws it right in your face. Like, oh, you're afraid of being attacked by somebody? And it just brings up so many things. Like, why is the virgin safe? Why is the person who has sex more apt to be killed? What does it say about sexuality and sexuality as being accepted in society? Because it's really not.
Exactly.
And that is displayed in the slasher films. And it's just so very fascinating. It's more than just mindless killing. When you really look at it, you could analyze it more than that.
Well, that's something that you and I have in common, is we both like having an origin story. And there were a couple of films where we're like, where did the killer come from? Why does the killer kill people? Why does he focus on women the way he does? So some of the slasher films, you get a background story, in it. You know what propels the killer to want to go after. That something happens in their life that causes them to want to go and kill people, especially in a certain age group. But then there's some that don't have that information. And those are the films that leave me questioning, like, why, like, they have to have something that prompts them to do it. They just don't wake up. I mean, even Leslie Vernon in Behind the Mask, he wants to do it from an occupational standpoint and
Yes.
wants to be elevated like his heroes, because, they're considered, famous. So he wants the accolades like that. But he also gives us an origin story as to why he's going to do it. Let's talk a little bit about where this all came, how it all started. I mean, where do slasher films originate from?
Well, we've got the early beginnings with the influences, like we've mentioned, Psycho is a big influence to the genre. We've mentioned movies like obviously Black Christmas, which really kind of set the standard, I think, of like the formula. But there's also eras, like you've mentioned this before. There are eras of slashers where some sites have said, okay, well, it starts, as you referenced earlier, some say 74, some say all the way back to the 50s, kind of referencing more of the Psycho period or Peeping Tom. Also, there's a lot of Italian movies that can be traced to a big influence of the genre or the subgenre of slashers as well. So lots of cool influences and beginnings of the genre. For instance, I mean, there is this one article which talks about a historical approach to the slasher film. They examined the evolution of the slasher film through time and divided the lifetime of the subgenre into 3 historical periods: the classical period, the postmodern period, and the neo-slashers. According to this examination that was done in 2014 by, I'm not going to say this right, but it's spelled Petridis. He says the classical period starts in 1974 and lasts until the end of the 80s. The postmodern period takes place in the 90s. And the neo-slashers started to evolve in the beginning of the new millennium, and the production of those filmic texts, lasts to now.
Right. So going through, I'm just going to briefly go through some of the films that kind of mark those decades, mark those periods of time. But they're saying even an early example of a slasher film, it's not a slasher film, but it's an early example of what would become the slasher film, is a film called 13 Women, all the way back in 1932.
Right.
I mean, it would be interesting to go back to see what the elements were for that film. Then, of course, we mentioned Psycho. That was 1960. It was an influence. But something that was interesting about Psycho is that it deals with themes of like psychoanalysis, the Oedipus complex. Those are important. Those become important in the slasher genre in later years. We see that. Also, Black Christmas. We talked about the Black Christmas. It's critically important to the slasher genre.
And I can't even believe that we just watched it this past Christmas.
Exactly.
We saw so Halloween gets all the attention, whereas Black Christmas is more of like a hidden gem, which is so funny because it really is the birth more than Halloween.
And it was the first great slasher of its time.
Right.
They have the tropes in it, like the babysitter getting the phone call, not going upstairs. And, during the holidays, you have a murder during the holidays. And Halloween was actually heavily influenced by this film, which I thought was neat. Then, of course, they talk about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That was also 1974. This was a critically important for the slasher genre, because it brought about one of the most important characters, or killers, I should say, in slasher history, and that was Leatherface. Right. It was the first time audience were seeing such violence, such gruesome, deaths at the time.
Now, I will say, some people argue, though, that this isn't a slasher. Some people, according to certain criterias on certain sites, they're saying, well, by this criteria, Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't fit.
And you know who agrees with that? Our friend Ray.
Yeah. But I think it is a slasher, personally.
I do too. Ray kind of feels like it's just, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You came upon these people and this is what they do. But I personally do think it's a slasher. It's almost like they bait a trap for people to come, because it's like in like the country, in a town that's been kind of dried up. So if people tend to break down in that area and they come upon these people for help, guess what? You come into the wrong house, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it's going to be terrible.
And they're
know.
using other weapons other than a gun. So I mean that fits. That's one
Exactly.
of the
Chainsaws,
primary, yeah,
hooks, you know.
primary elements there. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you've got, following on that is 1978, you have Halloween. Most important characters in film horror. I
Yeah.
mean, in horror film, uh, Michael Myers and Laurie Strode. Okay.
Yes.
They are two names that if you are a horror fan, you know them very well. This film created the slasher genre as we know it today. That's why it was important. Then you had When the Stranger Calls in 1979. It's more of a psychological thriller film, but this is what inspired the opening scene for Wes Craven's Scream.
Right.
So it has its importance. It also drew on the tropes, kind of like that were presented in like Black Christmas. Friday the 13th was 1980. You've got one of the most famous killers, Jason Voorhees. The trope of people being murdered at summer camp is big in this film, and many films afterwards follow that trope.
Yeah, I mean,
we
summer
saw
camp
one.
becomes a very popular setting after Friday the 13th in terms of horror, in terms of specifically slashers. I mean, we even have a whole chat about Sleepaway Camp, also
Right.
set at summer camp,
Mhm.
and that's considered a slasher as well. So to me, yeah, that's very influential, especially for the setting.
Right. Right. And then this was also one that had that whodunit format, you
Right.
know. So then we have in 1984, you've got the A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is a revolutionary slasher film because it introduces Freddy Krueger, into the horror canon. Okay, he's a new person on the scene. It talks about dreams being reality. It's him, addressing the whole situation of what happens. I mean, it like alludes to the fact that he was a pedophile. They don't actually say it because they didn't want to anger the people at the time, but we know that's basically what they were alluding to.
Yeah.
The
And I
themes
will
also.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that, like, this is the movie to me that bends the tropes kind of heavily. Like, I question sometimes, I'm like, when I watch Nightmare on Elm Street, it feels like a horror classic, but it doesn't feel like a slasher classic to me. So to me, even more than Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I feel like Nightmare on Elm Street bends the tropes a little bit. But it also
Yes.
sets the tropes in a way too,
But he
because
has those knives
he
on the
does
end of
have the
his fingers.
knives. It just
Slash,
doesn't
slash,
feel
slash.
as slashery as, let's say, Friday the 13th or Halloween. But I do consider it a slasher. It doesn't feel as slashery.
As slashery.
Yeah, to me personally. That's just a personal subjective opinion.
Well, then in 1988, we have Child's Play, one of the most unique killers come about. That's Chucky, who was the good guy doll.
Yeah, I love that.
And so this was fascinating for slasher genre because it's also talking about a vessel having some kind of possession to it, for horror. Then you've got Scream in 1996. That was the last great slasher of the genre, is what they kind of consider that. It
And
has
I will say,
many tropes.
There are lots of elements from Behind the Mask that really mirror Scream.
Yes.
Specifically, because Scream is another movie like Behind the Mask that does the whole meta thing where it's
Yes.
self-referential to other slashers. They're like, oh, these are the tropes, and they throw it in your face. I love that. It's a very smart film, very, very smart film.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I guess you could consider it one of the last great unique slashers that kind of did something different with the
It did, because
subgenre.
it basically parodied the slasher film, but they did it in a dark way. They didn't do it in a
Yes.
ha-ha funny way.
They parodied it, but they also did something new through the parody. So
Right.
all kinds of things at play there. Just honestly, in my opinion, a super smart, super almost genius type of film.
Exactly. Then you had 1997, you had I Know What You Did Last Summer. This is the first time you have like teen exploitation,
Yeah.
where you're looking at teens specifically in horror slasher. It's the first time you've got your victims kind of turning against each other, like starting to accuse each other of being the person that's, doing it. Also, you have a killer that doesn't have a mask, but hides the face and you don't realize who it is until,
Another
later
who
on
done
it's
it type
revealed.
of
Exactly.
story.
And one other one, and I'm not familiar with this. Maybe you've seen this film.
I
This is from 2014. It
hate this
follows.
movie.
Okay, well, they say it's a supernatural horror
See,
film, not
there's so
necessarily
much.
slasher. However,
Yeah.
they say it has many of the tropes of it, being a curse, the entity, kind of like possession, I guess, which would be similar to like the Chucky doll. But at the same time, I haven't seen it, so I can't say. You've seen it.
I
Why
can
do
say
you?
some things about this film. I don't
Okay.
feel like it's a slasher at all. The tropes, I understand what they're saying. Sex is bad. Okay, so that's one of the tropes
Mhm.
of basically slasher films. If somebody's having sex, they're probably going to be killed. That's why
Right.
usually the final girl, one of the tropes is that she's usually virginal. But whereas in It Follows, basically the main character has sex and she's kind of cursed because of that, and bad things befall her because of that. So essentially the main trope that it takes from the slasher subgenre is the whole idea of if you have sex, you could possibly die. It's bad. Don't do it. So that's basically the biggest similarity that I can think of why this would be listed as part of like the slasher vein or
Well, and that's also another
subgenre.
reason why they were talking about Nightmare on Elm Street, because they questioned that about the teen sex thing,
Exactly.
similar to what you would have
Nancy
found
was
like
kind of
in,
smart and pure. She wasn't like the party girl, who got destroyed at the beginning of the film. So that
right,
kind of establishes the sex trope as well. But so does
right.
Halloween. I mean,
Right. Well, that's
obviously,
what it says. It was kind of like, taking that from like Halloween.
right.
So you kind of see a similar theme running through many of the films, but then there are just some that walk the line that you're not really 100% sure.
I just don't
Now,
think It Follows. Besides that, it's a very popular movie in terms of the critics actually praise it. But both my friend Burke, who you know in our
uh-huh.
book club, Burke agrees with me. We don't feel like it's a good movie. We don't agree with any of the critics. Like I didn't like that movie. I thought like the plot was absurd. Like I was like, oh my god, this is so absurd. Like basically she has sex and like this thing follows her and she's got to have sex to pass it on to somebody else. It's very weird. Anyway, you could see it and judge for yourself. I specifically don't like it, and it puzzles me as to why it's on this list, but I think it's a great discussion. So I'm glad it's on the list because it's great to talk about. And there is that one element of the sex part of it. So I can
Right. So
understand
it
that.
uses that trope. And I think that's where we were getting kind of confused as to why some of our movies we pick for our
Let's
slasher
talk about that. Let's
list
talk about the
was,
movies.
yeah, because we were a little confused as to why they would have made somebody's list.
Yes.
I mean,
Alone in the Dark. Let's talk about that real
yeah,
quick.
let's
That's
talk
one of the
about that one.
again, guys, if you want to see what we have to say overall about the movie, today we're going to talk about, is it a slasher, is it not? But we basically broke down the movie and showed the best scene of the whole movie. It's not a spoiler, it's just great. You've got to see the scene. Go check out our overall chat. I'll link it again up here. And again, it's down in the description. But even in our overall chat, we're saying, is this really a slasher? Maybe it is. There is an axe. That's what we were saying during our overall chat.
There was a crossbow.
Yeah, but even after knowing that, I feel like it doesn't meet much of the other criteria at all.
No, because if you think about some of the things that we were talking about in the films that I mentioned, okay, instead of one killer, they have four.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, they do have a crossbow and they have an axe, but they also use a gun. They use a van. They use choking. They use a lot more they use other methods to try to get rid of their victims. They target a family.
Yeah.
They're not it's almost like a home invasion or like a misunderstanding
or like a thriller that is just like a super
psychological thriller.
Yeah, a super hybrid thriller. I wouldn't even consider it like a extreme horror movie or anything, personally.
No, I wouldn't either. And I think that's where, after reading all of the information that of the different articles and doing the research,
I feel like
I really do think, yes, there is, there are movies that are strictly slasher in the sense of where you can truly say it is. Halloween, Friday the 13th, those are, Sleepaway Camp, even Alice Sweet Alice, I have to, concede on that. But then there's some that just walk the line. And we've also found lists that include some of these movies and lists that don't.
As slashers, specifically.
So I really do think it's subjective. It's what you consider a slasher film based on what you know about slasher films. Um, what do you think? I mean, do you
I
agree or?
I I think it's just so hard to say, but what I can say is that I know for sure Alone in the Dark doesn't feel like a slasher out of all the different articles with all the different criteria we've flippin' researched. Whereas,
Mhm.
I mean, a movie like Hush, we could argue. Like we were talking about Hush before we started.
Yeah.
There are some movies that walk the line that could be, you flip a coin. It could pass technically, I guess barely. But I feel like I'm Alone in the Dark for me. My mind's made up. I don't think it's a slasher. Honestly, the more
Mhm.
we read about this, I'm like, it's not. Whereas Hush, you're still under the opinion where you don't really feel like it's a slasher. I'm gonna give it a pass. I think it could barely pass as one.
I mean, I think it does have slasher elements to it, but I think what doesn't work for me with Hush is not knowing where the killer comes from. We don't know what the motivation is. What is the event that sets him off? Is it? I think that's what bothers me about it. You don't have as many people getting killed.
Right.
There's some things that do match the slasher. He wears a mask. He uses a blade. He uses a crossbow. He stalks. It's the cat and mouse. But I don't know.
If we're going by that one site's definition, the main site finalgirl.com,
Mhm.
the primary elements have to be there for it to be considered a slasher. Now the secondary can or cannot be there, but the more
Right.
the better. So the primary, a killer stalks a group of people. Well, in Hush, it's one person he stalks technically for the majority of the film. He does kill more
Mhm.
people before he gets to stalking that one girl who's deaf and mute, but also but I will say he meets the criteria of using a weapon other than a gun, so that he's got it there. He checks
Mhm.
that box. But the majority of kills are sudden with limited suffering. However, no. The whole idea of the film is he's kind of torturing this girl psychologically. So that
Mhm.
makes me question that primary element really is not checked off. And again, this is just this one site's criteria.
Well, and
But
also too, you got to think about
still,
it. Like he was terrorizing her the whole time.
that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And if she would not have fought back, what would he have done with her? She intrigued him. I don't know if he would necessarily would have killed her quickly,
He
like he
wouldn't have
killed the
even said
neighbor.
I could come in whenever I want. He said that at one point in the movie, but he just didn't go in. He wanted to make her worry. He wanted her to freak out. He wanted essentially to battle with her, battle of the mind, who was stronger.
Right. And so to me, it was more of a psychological thriller because she was also in the psyche of a killer because she was a writer and those were the kind of books that she was writing,
Right.
So it's almost like, okay, if he does this, I'm going to do this, because I know that's what I would do. I mean, my character would do or whatever. So it was almost like the cat and mouse, but who was the cat, who was the mouse, kind of thing. So that's why I just don't think it's
So
a
that's your final
slasher.
verdict. You don't think it's a
Yeah, I
slasher?
just don't think that. I think it's more psychological thriller to me.
I
There's a lot going
lean
on.
I lean to agree with you, but I could see how some people would categorize it as a slasher, I
I
suppose. But
almost wish I could talk to the people that put it on these lists so I could
yeah,
say,
the
why do you call
lists.
it a slasher? Because
I
there's
mean,
so
like,
many lists.
there are, because Hush isn't just on one list. Now, I looked up, we talked about this in my overall chat with Kat. There was an article I looked up by Screen Rant, which literally said the 15 underrated slasher films, and Alone in the Dark was on there, which we both just said we don't believe is a flippin' slasher, and other ones that I don't believe were slashers, including Someone's Watching Me. I watched from a marathon because of the list, and I don't agree. Now, I will say Hush was on multiple lists, whereas
Mhm.
Someone's Watching Me was only on the Screen Rant list, and I honestly, truly do not believe it is a slasher. Now you can go and watch our overall chat and even see, you might not have seen it, but just if you want to see what the movie's about, we talk about it there. It's actually a John Carpenter film, but it's a made for TV
Mhm.
movie, and it was released just before Halloween, kind of like almost exactly the same time, like right the same year technically, but a little bit before. But yeah, I don't think it was one, but it was on this freaking article. So what are these article people thinking? What is their mindset? What is
Right. So I would
mindset?
like to know, like, why would you put this on the list? What constitutes it to them? You know,
Now
because
they wrote, oh, it's influential. You could almost see the patterns of Carpenter. You could see like the things he would draw on later. But what makes that
well
qualify it
then,
as a slasher though?
well then I would put it in a category like pre-slasher, like Psycho, or
Yeah.
13 Women or whatever,
There
the
was
Italian
stalking.
films.
In fact, I would consider it. So stalking is one of the secondary elements, according to that one site. There was stalking and someone's watching me. However, that was basically all it was. To me, I would even call it a stalker movie because there wasn't much killing at all. And the one kill, we don't even see it on camera. But anyway, yeah, check out our overall chat on that. Also, the same list mentioned Bloody Birthday. However, other lists talk about this movie as well. I don't agree with this. I don't think it's a slasher. There's a gun and there are other weapons shown, but to me, the gun is the primary weapon. One of the kids uses a gun multiple times, and there's 3 kids, and it's more like a creepy kid movie to me versus a slasher. So some movies you can make arguments all day about, is this really a slasher? And that's what's so fascinating. And I think that's the one thing we could all agree on, is it's kind of subjective. And
right.
It really
I mean,
depends
you
on
have
your
to,
criteria.
it does. I mean, because we're going to talk about later on our top 10 slasher films. What's yours? What's ours? We're going to do that in a future video. That's right. I mean, I watched Tourist Trap. I would not think that was a slasher film. That was some kind of supernatural horror movie, in my opinion. You watched it. You kind of agree with that. I did concede Terrifier did make the list of slasher after really doing the research on it. Also, I have to concede Alice Sweet Alice was. I almost thought Alice Sweet Alice kind of walked the line of being psychological thriller. However, it has that whodunit, format. It has the killer with it's the one killer with the mask. You've got the blade. You've got the, you do have somewhat stalking and watching and, so I concede and I, changed my mind on that.
That one was never in question for me personally,
I know. And then also too, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It was on a slasher list. That's why I put it on my list. It's kind of like the same thing with like Scream. It falls into that category. But then the more I really examined it, yes, it would be considered a slasher film. There is a killer in it. There's a lot of misunderstandings, but there's a lot of tropes in it, that classify it. So, I just decided that really and truly on my list, Alone in the Dark, Tourist Trap, and Hush were pretty much the ones that I don't think fall in the category of slasher.
I mean, Hush was on my list too. That one I'm still unsure about, but I'm leaning more towards agreeing with you, though. Honestly, the more you talked, you kind of convinced me over to your side. Because when we started, I was like, no, I think Hush is still a slasher. But as I heard your reasoning, I'm like, maybe it's not. So I agree with you on Hush. I definitely agree with you on Alone in the Dark. It just does not feel like a slasher at all. Still fun. I still loved it, but not a slasher. And also on my list that you didn't watch, Bloody Birthday, and to reiterate, Someone's Watching Me, just didn't feel like it. Just didn't feel like it at all. And so I still think our summer slasher marathon was a success, even though we had these few. I really am so glad I watched some of these. And I feel like we watched some things that I should have saw a long time ago. For instance, you could see on my back wall here, Sleepaway Camp, which we have that whole video on. I feel like I should have saw that long before. Now, I know you thought it was more cheesy. I liked it a lot more, but I thought it was marvelous. I will watch it again in the future, and that one definitely had a whodunit. That one's definitely
that is definitely slasher. It's definitely whodunit format.
Right.
And I mean, I didn't hate it. I mean, the acting was cheesy to me. That's what was cheesy about it. Not so much like the premise of it.
Right. Of
course. I mean, the ending is awesome. Very creepy, very surprising. I was blown away. I had never seen it, didn't even know anything about it. So that's why it was very surprising. It was like, what did I just watch? Kind of thing. So, but, and also too, what do you think about the Fear Street trilogy? I mean,
that walks the line too, but except for 78. No, 78, the second installment, I feel like definitely fits, especially because for the most part, there's one main guy who's doing the killing, basically. Later, we have a few more killers, but that's very at the end. For the majority of the film, we've got one main guy, and he kind of follows the slashing standard way of being. Like in slasher movies, he follows the tropes.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, overall, if you look at the trilogy as a whole, I would say, yes, slasher. just because each film has the elements, 1978 having the most. Also, because the setting is a summer camp, it's an homage to Friday the 13th, in my opinion.
Oh yeah,
We talked
definitely.
about that in our Fear Street video.
Yeah, well, I'll link that up here as well and down there because we've had so many chats over this marathon. It's been marvelous.
Yeah.
And that's why it just tells you that there's so much to dissect when you talk about slashers.
I mean, it's really getting me very, very, very excited about our Halloween
I can't wait.
marathon, because I just felt like I went into the slasher, marathon thinking, okay, it's going to be fun. I'm going to add some new movies. I had one rewatch, whatever. Love the fact that I was getting to know something about Fear Street because I had never read the books, but I came out of the marathon just like really like excited. Loved the
Right.
movies, was excited about having all of our chats about every movie that we had, watched, especially the ones in common, so now I'm like really pumped up
Me too.
about
Can't
Halloween.
wait.
Like, what are we gonna do?
I don't know because we've had so many chats over 15 films. Like, what happens when I have like 20 plus films? Because, by the way, guys, this is a spoiler. Right now, I've got 50 films scheduled for October marathon. There's no way. I have a feeling there's no way. Last year, I was able to watch 65 total movies somehow. There's just no way this year is going to be that great in terms of productivity. No way.
Kelsey's the beast.
I'm
She is
aiming
the
high,
beast.
but
She
I'm
is
not
the
gonna.
beast when she comes to watching her horror movies.
I
That's for
try.
sure.
But yeah, if we have this much to talk about over 15 movies, I mean, you had 13, but I had 15, but what's
I
going to
started
happen?
off with 10.
Yeah, and then you increased. So what's going to happen though when we have like a ton more for Halloween? But I'm excited because it just makes you think all of these movies, and it's fun because you and I don't look at it just at the surface level. So I hope you guys enjoy us taking these deep dives because we don't want to just give you, you know, the summary of the plots. We want to kind of go deeper and look at what does this mean? What is this? What is that? And so hopefully you guys have enjoyed that too. And also if you have any suggestions on movies you want us to take more, deeper looks at, deeper dives into, leave it in the comments below. We want to know.
Oh yeah, because especially after having my little Friday the 13th thematic date night with my husband, we're going to explore the rest of the franchise. I don't know if we're going to include some for Halloween or every Friday the 13th that pops up in the year.
There's one next year and two the next year.
Good.
In 2023, one's on my birthday.
Oh
yeah, I'm excited about it.
But I think I probably will add one for Halloween because I had a little snafu. I didn't get to make my Jason Voorhees shot, and I think I know of a place that I can get the last ingredient. So if I can get that last ingredient before Halloween, I think I'm going to make that shot. So that Friday the 13th part 2 may end up on the list.
So essentially, we're not really done with slashers then. They could pop up on our next marathon.
Oh yeah, because we actually had slashers on our Halloween list and Christmas. Christmas Evil, one of your favorite films ever.
I love that movie.
Is a slasher film.
I was actually going to joke with you and say that I want to rewatch it this Christmas and make you laugh. I kind of do want to rewatch it though, for real. I really do.
I almost wonder if I should rewatch it now that I'm a little more I have a little more information about slasher films. I can look at it from that aspect of it, but I just don't know if I can.
God, I want you to just because I know it'd be hilarious.
The cheese factor.
Cheese is amazing. I love that movie.
Well, because you like the corn. You like the corn. I do like some cheese. So
you like characters a lot. Yeah. But I like the corn the most. To me, it doesn't even have to have a good character, or it doesn't even have to have good acting. If it's cheesy, it's like, that's something that's a pro in my book.
Right.
So, whatever.
Well, before we sign off, don't you have something else to add?
Yes.
I mean, isn't there a great book or anything that we can refer to?
I have a suggestion for people who, like me, love slashers and not only slasher movies, but slasher books. I feel like this would be a great thing for anyone to check out if they like the slasher subgenre in general. This is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix, and I've read it. There are a lot of differing opinions online, I gotta say. Personally, I loved it, and I think if you're a fan specifically of horror movies and horror slasher movies, I feel like you'd love this book because there's a lot of kind of like behind the mask. I feel like there was a lot of winks and nods at fans of horror slasher films. And Grady Hendrix even said this was like his ode to slasher films. And you
Mhm.
could see that because a lot of the final girls who are in the support group, they're from situations that spoof movies. Like, for instance, there's one who faced, like, her killer was known as the Dream King in a lot of newspapers. And so, of course, that spoofs Nightmare on Elm Street. And they talk
Right.
about it like that. There's a whole bunch of them. There's one, the babysitter killer, obviously spoofing Halloween. So there's lots of little like meta references in here that talk about the genre, but there's also stuff that really takes a deep dive into why does society like to put these killers on a pedestal. So I think
Mhm.
that's really fascinating that the book kind of, you know, examines that lightly. There's all these like quotes throughout the book from like fake articles talking about like why do we as a society like when people are killed? Why do
Well,
we
and
raise
that's
up the person?
talking about society, that was another thing that I had come across in some of the literature that I read, was that sometimes the movie was whatever was happening in society at the time
Yeah.
was kind of like, an undertone in some of these films. So, I mean, I just think
Again,
it's
playing up on our
fascinating.
fears, playing up on what's happening. And that's what horror is so good at, drawing at those type of things. But again, guys, if you love slasher films specifically,
Mhm.
I don't know what other people, why they gave this a low rating. I'm giving it, I haven't officially rated it, but on Goodreads, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5.
Mhm.
And I've read
I
quite a
can't
few.
wait. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I've read quite a few Grady Hendrix books. And so to me, it fits in. Some people were saying it's not very Grady Hendrix like. However, I think it is very Grady Hendrix like because basically what he writes about is a group of usually women, and one of them kind of feels like the outsider of the group. One of them basically ends up having to face all kinds of odds and find some inner strength and grow as a person. And at the end, you see them come out the other side of whatever situation, because there's different books that all have this same theme. Whatever the situation is, the character comes out and is stronger, better, and basically just a more evolved person from what they were in the beginning of the
Mhm.
novel. So it's a very Grady Hendrix book. I don't know why people are saying it's not like him. It very much is, because he's had that same kind of formula for My Best Friend's Exorcism. He's had that same formula for, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. So to me, it fits in right with those two books, with the same
Mhm.
type of theme, with the whole singular woman facing everything alone. Then she comes out the other side stronger, and her friendships at the end are also stronger. They
Mhm.
go through a test and it winds up better at the end. So to me, this book is wonderful, and it's got the slasher references that you'd love to see if you're a slasher horror movie fan. So yes, check it out, guys, and judge it for yourself. Now,
Mhm.
I understand why some people, it's subjective, they might not like it. However, I loved it. 5 out of 5. Wonderful stuff. Yeah, we
Well,
got to get
I'm gonna check it out and I'm going to read it, and
you've
then
got to
I'll
get
let
into
you know
Grady
for
Hendrix
sure.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
you got to, no matter if it's this or My Best Friend's Exorcism, all of it. It's good. It's good
Mhm.
stuff. All right,
Yeah.
guys. Well, that's some of the stuff we had to say. And I will say, like I said, to repeat, leave any suggestions of movies below, because we are crafting our Halloween list right now. Kat and I are
Mhm.
trying to cement it and think of the movies we're definitely going to watch that are the same, so we could start to plan future singular chats. So your comments will be helpful if there's something that you really want to see us talk about, because we do want to talk about things that you guys want to hear us talk about for sure. And I will say, somebody left a comment about this movie called, I think it was called Driller Killer.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about adding it. Honestly, I looked it up. It looks.
It doesn't look like anything that's on the same scale as Rotten Tail, though.
No, no, no. It
Oh,
looks
okay.
it looks fascinating. I honestly, I want to check it out, but you don't have to, Kat. But I think I'm going to add it to my list. So,
Well, I just don't do anything that's torture porn. I'm
oh
going to
no,
just say
no.
that right now. I don't do that. And
I
I don't
actually
do anything that's going to have like really hardcore, horrible things that happen to women.
I'm pretty easygoing. I'm actually more easygoing with books than movies, but still suggest it,
Yes,
and we'll
same
make.
here.
I can't guarantee that we'll add what you suggest, but we'll definitely consider anything. We
Mhm.
may not accept it, like we may not actually add it, but we'll definitely consider it.
And depending on what part of horror it is, it could possibly be watched for Christmas or a later marathon that we have later in the year. If it's a slasher, we can always, keep it
Save it
for
for
the
next
next
year.
time. Yeah, that we do our
Yeah.
summer slasher. So, I mean, even if we don't do it for Halloween, if it falls in another category for us, we could always check it out. Or if we just want to have something to watch on the weekend.
Yeah, just a fun random horror movie. And so as we wrap up, any more final thoughts about this wonderful summer slasher marathon, or maybe Behind the Mask, or slasher films in general? Kat, what do you have to say?
I just have to say that the genre of horror is more intricate
Yeah.
the more horror movies that I watch. And I really thought, um, I had a lot of horror movies under my belt. So adding everything that we've been watching this past year and then delving into the slashers, watching films that, are either a parody of, a slasher film or a horror film has been eye-opening. And I'm not talking about the haha funny ones, but the ones that really are an homage,
Yes.
to horror films or slasher films in general. So it really is opening my eyes. It's making me more excited to learn more about the
Yeah.
genre, and to watch more films and to give other films that I've watched, maybe another chance.
Right.
There's some movies I know I will never watch again,
Right.
just because of whatever the content was. But then there's some that I would rewatch again, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but again in the future, revisit it. Because I think that through our conversations, we're learning a lot more. We're examining more of what the film is about besides just it being pure horror.
Honestly, I think with every marathon, we are becoming better and better and more knowledgeable horror fans. And that's great because,
Mhm.
you guys might be way farther along with your horror fandom than us. I always thought I was a really intense
Yeah.
horror fan, but really I've discovered that I have so much left to watch that I haven't already seen. And that's because, like I've told you in previous chats, for years I just kept focusing my horror viewing in October, and I also kept rewatching the same movies, like my favorites. And so I would
Right.
never really experience some of the other movies that might be less known, or maybe I knew about them, but
Mhm.
I just didn't get to them, or just, lesser movies that like lesser known movies. I just didn't
Mhm.
get to them. But now with these marathons, I feel like because I've pushed my viewing to year round with these, and also I'm pushing the different types that I've been checking out and really going for little movies that I've been meaning to get to forever. I feel like we're becoming better fans, and it's great.
Mhm.
It's so much
Mhm.
fun. And I think this summer slasher marathon specifically for me was a success, and I feel I enjoyed the whole thing. I really, even though we had those
Mhm.
movies that weren't slashers technically, we think at the end we still don't think they're slashers. I still think it was fun. I still enjoyed it. I still think it was a blast.
Yeah, because we still discussed them. We had still had topics to address, even in the
Yeah.
ones that, we either didn't care for 100% or we didn't think fit in the category. It still brought up wonderful discussions. And
I
that's
will always like Alone in the Dark for the mailman scene. I never regret having that movie on the list because mailman, insert here.
That. I want that.
What are you, some kind of asshole?
That's right. And I won't regret it either because it was one of the horror movies that we watched together. So that made it even
Yes.
more special.
I mean,
So,
because your laugh when you saw it was just so marvelous. Like your laughter, my laughter at this act, it was just a great feeling. It was wonderful. I love that scene. Anyway, don't get me started on it. I'll talk about it for the rest of the chat. But thank you guys so much. We know the chats are long, but we have a lot of fun just taking a more academic look at some of this stuff. And we're glad you're with us and along for the ride. Again, comment below. Check out Kat's blog. It's also linked in the description. And she's going to be, talking about this and wrapping this up. And she'll also be hyping up for Halloween time and her fun list and our marathon for that. So be sure to subscribe to her blog for sure. And you can always comment there too. So no matter where you comment, we just love to interact and see those comments and have a back and forth with you guys. But as far as viewing, we also appreciate that even more. So thanks so much. But for this time, that's it for us, right, Kat?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's it. Until next time.
Yep, keep on killing it. Bye.
Bye.